You were never supposed to hear this. Not from a history book, not from a preacher, not even from your ancestors. There's a whisper buried in the cold soil of upstate New York. A whisper clawing its way through centuries of silence. A secret so deeply buried, it required 143 bodies to keep it hidden. They were found beneath a church. A church no one remembers building, on land no one remembers selling. Their bones told the story first. Twisted limbs healed wrong, burn scars patterned like scripture, eyes gouged from sockets, not out of rage, but ritual. This isn't religion. This isn't madness. This is design. The story I'm about to tell you is not fiction. It's not myth. Though it reads like the blackest fable ever carved into forgotten scripture, it is the true, macabre history of the Família Nocturna, a name erased from public records, a family that operated under a different name, one that still echoes in dark places of power. Ravenscroft. It was never just a name, it was a system, a structure of influence, a bloodline of control. In 1825, 3 brothers walked into Ravenwood like wandering apostles. But they weren't sent by heaven. They were architects of psychological enslavement. Elder Ezra, Deacon Silas, Prophet Caleb. Each man represented an arm of domination, physical, intellectual, and spiritual. Together they built something that went far beyond a church. They built a mechanism for reshaping human will, a machine for breaking the soul and rebuilding it in their image. The Church of the Pure Spirit was never meant to save anyone. It was built to see who could be broken and still obey. And people did obey. They obeyed until they screamed. They obeyed until their bones snapped like twigs in winter. They obeyed until they died. And even then, the dead obeyed. You see, the Ravenscrofts understood something that modern institutions only pretend to forge. If you can make a man believe his pain has purpose, you can make him your slave. Tonight, I'll take you into the chambers they carved beneath the stone, into the rituals, the trials, and the voices that whispered not from heaven, but from something far older. You think you've heard dark history before? You haven't. Not like this. And once you know, you won't unknow. Now lean in, because this is where it begins. They called it Ravenwood, a quiet farming town nestled between the forests like a secret kept by the trees themselves. Nothing extraordinary on the surface. It had no industry, no military value, no political clout. Just 300 souls scraping life from earth and lumber, trading goods with nearby settlements. But it was chosen for a reason. Chosen by men who didn't believe in coincidence, only in convergence. This land had history. Not the kind taught in schools, but the kind whispered through root and river. Native legends warned of hollow places in the ground where voices echoed too long. Surveyors in the 1700s reported magnetic anomalies near the ridge. And when the Ravenscroft brothers arrived in 1825, they claimed the spirit had guided them to this precise place. But that wasn't spiritual rhetoric, it was reconnaissance. They were looking for something, and they found it. Ezra, Silas, Caleb. 3 men bound not by blood alone, but by a vision. Ezra, the iron voice, a preacher with eyes like ink and a stare that made men forget their own names. Silas, the scholar, a man who wrote scriptures faster than he bled. And Caleb the youngest, was different. He didn't speak to crowds. He whispered to individuals. He didn't preach fire. He breathed it into your soul. There was something wrong with his eyes, they said. Something not quite human. When they built their church, stone, not wood, locals noticed. Why such extravagance for a town so small? Why no windows in the sanctuary? Why that strange 8-pointed layout, more star than steeple? But no one dared ask. The people were starving for answers, for meaning, for hope. The country was fractured. The old denominations were losing grip, and the new ones hadn't yet taken root. Faith had become a battleground, and every man was searching for his own Messiah. So when the Ravenscrofts preached suffering as salvation, it didn't repel them, it seduced them. Because pain makes sense when someone promises it leads somewhere. By 1826, the Church of the Pure Spirit had already begun choosing vessels. Not everyone was eligible. You had to be special, you had to be ready. And what made someone ready? Loss, guilt, shame. They didn't want the strong, they wanted the broken, because the broken are easier to rebuild. And once you were in, there was no out, no light, no windows, just the dark stone. And the voice behind the voice, the one even Caleb wouldn't name. The initiation was never written down, not in official records, but fragments remain, journal entries smuggled from the compound, confessions whispered on deathbeds. And one letter, blood-stained, never mailed, hidden behind a loose brick in a farmhouse, now long abandoned. It began with fasting, not for days, but for weeks. Water was rationed, food was symbolic, a crust of mold-dark bread, a single bitter herb. Sleep was discouraged. They called it the unbinding. You were told to confess your worst memory to the candlelight over and over until your voice cracked and your mind split open. Only then were you considered worthy of Prophet Caleb's attention. He would visit you in the dark, alone, never speaking at first, only watching. Witnesses say you could feel him before you saw him, a stillness, a chill, like something in the room was deciding whether you belonged. Then he would speak, not loud, not soft, but inside you. His words bypassed your ears, they went directly into your spine. You'd feel warmth, followed by pain. Some collapsed, some screamed, some begged to leave, but none did. Because once Prophet Caleb touched your mind, you didn't want to leave. You wanted more. They trained you to see your agony as sacred, your wounds as holy. You were told that each broken part of you was being burned away so your spirit could ascend. You were no longer a person. You were a tool, a vessel. And tools don't cry. They serve. Then came the true branding. You weren't just welcomed, you were marked. A series of geometric patterns, spirals, crosses, glyphs, carved into your back using obsidian shards dipped in ash and blood. Each symbol corresponded to a trial. Each trial was said to unlock a deeper connection to the spirit. But some of the markings matched older scripts, Babylonian, Enochian, symbols tied to texts that were banned by every major religion for centuries. Why? Because these were not signs of worship. They were signs of ownership. By 1828, over 70 people bore the marks. They smiled in public, traded in markets, hugged their children. But beneath their clothes, they were branded like cattle, owned not just by the Ravenscroftofts, but by whatever the Ravenscroftofts served. And still, no one asked questions, because good people fear what they cannot explain. And the church knew how to keep the good people busy, with hope and horror. The town changed. Slowly, then all at once. At first it was subtle. Less laughter in the streets, fewer children playing past dusk. Windows shuttered earlier. Conversations became whispers. People still smiled, but their eyes never quite matched. It was as if Ravenwood itself had inhaled a breath it would never exhale. The forest pressed closer. The crows multiplied. And from the steeple of the Church of the Pure Spirit, a low hum could sometimes be heard at night, a sound that made dogs whimper and babies cry in their sleep. The Ravenscroftofts claimed it was the voice of the Spirit guiding them to deeper truths. But not all believed. One man, Samuel Dyer, began to investigate. A former Methodist circuit rider turned schoolteacher, Dyer had seen revivals, but nothing like this. He noticed students returning to class hollow-eyed, their handwriting shaking as if from cold or fear. He heard rumors of basements beneath the church, and he began to ask questions. He wrote to friends in Albany, requesting official inquiries. Weeks later, he disappeared. His cabin was found empty. A single page remained on his desk. It read only, "The root is deeper than the tree must fall." The town's sheriff, Thomas Gale, went to investigate, and was never seen again. That was the moment, the line, the point of no return. After that, silence reigned. The church had grown too strong, not just in numbers, but in influence. They weren't just leading sermons, they were running the economy. They owned the largest grain silo, the blacksmith worked for them, the lumber mill reported to them. Even the mayor, quiet, trembling, tired, began ending speeches with, "May the Spirit keep us pure." Fear isn't always loud. Sometimes it comes dressed in Sunday best. Behind the sermons, the Ravenscroftofts were perfecting their rituals. The elevations became more frequent, the underground chambers expanded, and their theological justification grew darker, sharper, like a blade honed by repetition. They claimed that the world was already under judgment, and only the chosen would be allowed to transcend when the final trumpet of flesh sounded. What did that mean? No one knew, but the followers repeated it like gospel. Trumpet of flesh, trumpet of flesh. Say something enough times, it stops being strange. It becomes scripture. That's how psychological control works, not by force, but by repetition, isolation, conditioning. The people of Ravenwood didn't just fear the Ravenscroftofts, they needed them. Because once someone tells you your pain has purpose, you'll beg them for more. December 21st, 1829. The longest night of the year. They called it the First Ascension. That morning, the frost refused to melt. Not even when the sun rose. Trees cracked under the weight of a stillness no wind dared disturb. A silence that felt expectant. By dusk, over 150 followers stood shoulder to shoulder inside the windowless sanctuary, sealed in with iron locks that clicked shut from the outside. 12 candles were lit, each one placed precisely at the edges of an enormous spiral carved into the floor, an 8-coiled pattern mirrored in ancient Nordic blood rituals and certain forbidden Masonic rites. The scent of frankincense and decaying flowers hung in the air. They weren't just gathering for prayer, they were being prepared for something older than faith. Elder Ezra took the center platform. His eyes were wild, his voice cracked like thunder through stone as he proclaimed the time had come. "We have been cleansed by fire, air, earth, and water," he said. "But now the spirit demands sacrifice. The soul must be emptied so the spirit may enter." Then Prophet Caleb emerged. Something was wrong with his body. It didn't move like a man. It lurched, twitched, jerked in rhythm with a drum no one could hear. His skin was almost translucent. His jaw moved independently from his words. Witnesses said it felt like watching a puppet speak, with someone else's hand inside his mind. He named 3 followers aloud: Sarah Pembroke, Michael Collins, Rebecca Winters. They were led forward, trembling, not in resistance, but in awe. To be chosen was the highest honor. They were stripped, bound to inverted crosses, symbols of humility, or so they were told. In reality, they were echoes of ancient martyr rituals used to invert the soul's polarity, to tear the self apart and make room for something other. The congregation was told to sing. Through suffering comes purity. Oh, through purity comes elevation. Then came the 7 trials: suffocation, burial, burning, drowning, starvation, isolation, and finally, revelation. Hours passed. Screams became song. Blood became offering. By dawn, the 3 were dead. No one cried. They were told the dead had ascended. Their bodies, now holy relics, were placed in a stone chamber below the church to be honored for generations. This was not death. This was indoctrination perfected. The true purpose of the church wasn't salvation. It was conversion, not of belief, but of identity. From that moment forward, nothing in Ravenwood was untouched. The First Ascension changed more than ritual. It changed reality. There was a look in the eyes of those who remained, a glassy, distant gleam, like something inside had been hollowed out and filled with obedience. The Church of the Pure Spirit wasn't just a congregation anymore. It was a machine. Every sermon began with recitation, every morning with silence, every evening ended in a shared chant whispered 3 times. The vessel empties, the vessel receives, the vessel becomes. It wasn't just symbolic. These people believed it, lived it, some even craved it. Children were born into the church and raised without mirrors. Mirrors, the Ravenscroftofts claimed, encouraged vanity, the first sin. But the deeper truth was far more sinister. They didn't want their followers to recognize themselves. They wanted to erase selfhood entirely. Identity was the greatest obstacle to obedience, and once stripped of self, you were pliable, malleable, useful. Men who once questioned orders began volunteering for pain. Women who once wept at funerals now rejoiced when their loved ones were selected for higher refinement. And beneath the surface, literally, a new structure was growing. The catacombs. Expanded weekly by the most devoted, those they called stonehands. These weren't architects. These were followers who had given up speaking entirely, communicating only through symbols scrawled into the dust with broken fingers. Each tunnel had a purpose, a ritual function. Chamber of trials, chamber of saints, chamber of wombs, chamber of silence. And then, at the center, deep below the altar where the first ascension occurred, the root. It wasn't on any plan. It wasn't spoken of publicly, but records taken decades later described it as a vast circular pit carved by hand, its walls etched with symbols older than age. Some believe the root wasn't built. It was uncovered, a relic of something that had always been there, waiting. And what did the Ravencroft-offs do once they opened it? They began feeding it. Not flesh, not blood. Belief. Pure, uncut, undiluted faith, siphoned from every ritual, every scream, every prayer. Because if there's one constant across all ancient systems of power, it's this. Belief is currency. Belief is energy. Belief is a doorway. And the Ravencroft-offs weren't just opening that door, they were preparing to walk through it. By 1832, Ravenwood was no longer a town. It was a containment zone. A sealed reality governed by three men, Ezra, Silas, and Caleb, who claimed divine knowledge but practiced something far older than any scripture. Visitors rarely stayed. Travelers passing through reported a strange stillness in the streets. The trees didn't rustle. The air smelled wrong. One man said the wind itself seemed to move around the town, refusing to enter. Animals avoided the forest. Birds flew wide arcs around the church steeple as if it exhaled something unnatural. But the people of Ravenwood, they thrived in this silence. They weren't broken. They were rewritten. What the Ravencroft-offs had engineered wasn't merely a cult, it was spiritual software, a system of psychological operations that reprogrammed the human will. Most cults work through fear. The Church of the Pure Spirit worked through worship, and worship, when weaponized, doesn't free the soul. It imprisons it. Each member was given a new name, an ascendant title, stripped of their former identity. Birth records were burned, family histories erased. You were no longer Sarah or James or Margaret. You became the Vessel of Light or Child of Ember or the Mouth of the River, names chosen by Prophet Caleb in his midnight visions. They told you, the world outside is corrupted, only here are you clean. And to stay clean, you had to remain obedient. Obedience was safety. Doubt was disease. And if doubt did arise, if someone began to question, they were invited to the Chamber of Echoes. You didn't scream in the Chamber of Echoes. That wasn't allowed. You listened to yourself for hours, sometimes days. Recordings, scratchy, warped, looped your own voice back at you, distorted and reversed, layered beneath Caleb's chants. It wasn't torture in the traditional sense. It was erasure, cognitive dissonance, engineered to collar. As the psyche, when you emerged, if you did, you were new. Witnesses say one man came out laughing, not joyfully, but endlessly. They called him the bell that doesn't stop. But others, they came out perfect, obedient, silent, eyes empty of all resistance. And this is where you, the listener, must pause. Because if you've made it this far, you're not here by accident. Comment "The Root Remembers" below, twice, to lock in this moment. To signal your awareness. To mark the point where you stopped being asleep. This isn't just a story, it's a mirror. And some mirrors never give you your reflection back. By the mid-1830s, the Ravencroft-offs were no longer just preachers, they were engineers of the soul. And the Church of the Pure Spirit, it had become something far more dangerous than a cult. It was now a closed system, a spiritual totalitarianism wrapped in sacred language. Every thought, every action, every emotion was interpreted through the doctrine of purification through suffering. Joy was indulgence. Grief was holy. Pain wasn't something to flee. It was a gift from God. But God was no longer the deity most would recognize. Prophet Caleb began referring to the voice beyond the veil. Not God, not Jesus, just the voice. He claimed it spoke to him not in dreams, but through vibrations in the stone beneath the church. It gave him songs, geometries, and instructions. And those instructions became commandments. The church introduced new rituals. One was called the Unraveling, a 3-day ceremony where followers fasted, blindfolded, and knelt before the altar in silence. At the end, they would confess their darkest thoughts aloud into a pit carved beneath the sanctuary floor. That pit, they said it whispered back. Then came the resealing, a violent public spectacle where those found spiritually impure were bound in hemp ropes and anointed with hot wax while the congregation recited, "Not my will, not my name, not my voice, only the spirit remains." One man didn't survive the resealing. He had whispered before collapsing, "There is no voice, only Caleb." For that heresy, his body was dismembered and left at the forest's edge as a warning to the watchers, outsiders who might interfere. But here's the truth. There were no outsiders anymore. The nearest towns refused to intervene, some out of fear, some out of ignorance, and others because they were paid. That's right. The Ravencroft had begun acquiring influence beyond Ravenwood. A merc, Hant in Albany, a judge in Troy, a senator's cousin in Buffalo. Bribes were offered, land was traded, secrets were kept. You see, true power doesn't just hide, it networked, it adapted. And by the time authorities began suspecting something, the church was no longer just a physical place. It was a blueprint, a spiritual technology, a virus of the mind. And the Ravencroft, they were already replicating it, preparing new branches in Ohio, in Pennsylvania, even as far south as Georgia. What started in Ravenwood was never meant to stay there. It was meant to spread. In 1839, a traveler named Elias Wren entered Ravenwood under the guise of a religious scholar. But Wren was no scholar. He was a war veteran turned investigator, hardened by what he'd seen at the frontier and disgusted by whispers of what he'd heard coming out of upstate New York. Families vanishing, entire lineages disappearing from census rolls, letters intercepted, land purchases unrecorded. Elias had heard rumors, rituals, disappearances, bones in the woods, but nothing prepared him for what he found. His journal, later recovered from the ruins of his burned cabin, tells the story. He wrote, "The moment I crossed into Ravenwood, the air shifted. Not colder, not heavier, just wrong. The people smiled, but their smiles didn't reach their eyes. Every door had strange symbols carved near the hinges. I asked about the church. They said only the pure could enter. I asked who the pure were. They said, those who no longer ask." He stayed 3 nights at the inn. Each night he claimed to hear a humming, low, rhythmic, metallic, like something mechanical deep underground. But the turning point came on the 4th day. A child approached him. 8 years old, dirt on her face, no shoes. She handed him a small folded scrap of parchment. Inside, a map, a crude drawing of the catacombs and a single phrase, "Under the saints, the root sleeps." That night, Elias made his way to the church. He crept in through a storm drain at the base of the foundation, half-flooded, slick with mold and bone fragments. He found them, the catacombs. He found rooms of silence where bodies hung suspended by copper wire, mouths sewn shut, eyes wide open. He found the chamber of saints, where corpses in various states of decay sat propped in pews, wearing ceremonial robes and copper crowns. And then he found the root, a vast circular pit, its walls carved with symbols that pulsed with unnatural heat, though no fire burned. In the center, suspended over the abyss by a web of ropes and beams, a chair. And in that chair, Prophet Caleb. Eyes rolled back, mouth open in a perpetual, breathless whisper. He didn't move. He didn't blink. He was alive. And something beneath him was listening. Elias fled. He never spoke of it again, at least not aloud. But his final journal entry, they are not worshipping God. They are feeding something that remembers before God was named. The journal of Elias Wren didn't survive long. Just weeks after its discovery, the cabin that housed it burned to the ground. No witnesses, no investigation. But not before copies were made. Not before whispers began circulating in closed rooms, in academic circles, in underground religious study groups, and even among disillusioned members of law enforcement. The knowledge couldn't be buried forever. It had already taken root. But here's the most terrifying part. When the state finally sent a team to Ravenwood in the spring of 1841, they found nothing. Not nothing like ruins, not nothing like a ghost town. I mean nothing. No church, no catacombs, no Ravenscroft brothers, no followers, not even ash. The land was overgrown, untouched, as though no structure had ever stood there. Trees had grown in perfect concentric rings around a bare circle of soil so black it shimmered under the sun like obsidian powder. They brought in geologists. They brought in priests. They brought in men with guns. None of them could explain it. There were no building remnants, no bones, no artifacts. And yet, beneath the surface, instruments recorded vibrations, low and rhythmic, as if something was still turning, still humming. Locals refused to speak of it. Some claimed they never heard of a place called Ravenwood. Others said the town had been renamed and relocated decades prior. But a very few, spoke quietly of the sleepers. They said Ravenwood wasn't destroyed. It was withdrawn, folded into itself, hidden in plain sight. The faithful had completed the cycle. They had purified themselves fully. They had become what the Ravenscroft promised. Empty vessels, not dead, not alive. Useful. Useful for what? That answer lies deeper still. You see, this isn't just history. This is methodology. The Ravenscroft weren't just cult leaders. They were architects and the root. It wasn't a place. It was a technology, designed to replicate, to seed itself into minds, into systems, into stories like this one. So if you're watching, if you've made it this far, you haven't escaped it, you've entered it. And now, it knows your name. From 1841 onward, the historical record fractures. There is no mention of Ravenwood in census reports, no deeds, no church rosters, just silence. But silence doesn't mean absence. It means something was removed, and in its place, something else was allowed to grow, quietly, strategically, deliberately. In 1843, a seminary was founded less than 60 miles from where Ravenwood once stood. Publicly, it taught theology and moral philosophy. Privately, its founder, Jonathan H. Temple, had received a box of unknown origin. Inside, pages from Elias Wren's journal, a copper pendant in the shape of a spiral, and a map with only 2 words scrawled across it: Echo Route. Temple's seminary attracted a very specific kind of student. Brilliant, obsessive, unshakable. Not men of faith, men of pattern recognition. Men who understood the power of belief systems when combined with ritual architecture, sensory deprivation, and sacred geometry. And over the next 20 years, this secret fraternity developed what they called the continuum. They didn't preach. They installed ideas, symbols, scripts, in government agencies, in educational curriculums, in the internal memoranda of religious organizations, little pieces of the Church of the Pure Spirit, scattered like seeds across American infrastructure. You think cults only exist on remote compounds? Think again. Every system that controls behavior through invisible rules is a cult. Every narrative that demands your obedience without question is a doctrine. And every institution that punishes you for asking why is an echo of Ravenwood. Let me be clear, the Ravenscroft may have vanished from public memory, but their methods did not. In 1864, an anonymous paper titled On the Psycho-Spiritual Yield of Ritualized Pain appeared in the archives of the Massachusetts Medical Society. It outlined techniques identical to Hose used in the 7 trials of purification. It was never published, but photocopies circulated. In 1891, a prison warden in Louisiana implemented a new reform program that used silence, isolation, and mirror punishment to induce obedience. Sound familiar? In 1913, a psychologist named Dr. Ellis Brock claimed he could rewire a man's moral compass in 72 hours using sensory erosion and naming inversion, both tactics pioneered by the Church of the Pure Spirit. You see the pattern, don't you? You see the spiral? You think you're immune? You're not. You've heard the voice now, and it never stops whispering. By the turn of the 20th century, the name Ravenscroft had disappeared from every public ledger, library archive, and church registry. But you can erase a name. You cannot erase a blueprint. It had already replicated into symbols, ideologies, behavioral science, and most dangerously of all, bureaucracy. In 1924, a classified report circulated within a hidden branch of the U.S. Psychological Operations Division. Title: Group Persuasion via Escalated Compliance, Historical Precedents. Its contents: detailed case studies, not just from Ravenwood, but from locations across the globe. A monastery in Romania, 1765. A sect in Nagano Prefecture, Japan, 1832. A penal colony in French Guiana, 1874. All of them used nearly identical techniques: trials of pain, symbolic death and rebirth, language distortion, forced confession, worship through obedience, different names, same spiral. And every time, once the pattern matured, something descended. Some described it as a voice. Some saw it as a face, half-formed. Others felt it only as pressure. In the chest, in the skull, in the soul. That's the thing about forbidden systems. They don't just control people, they summon something. Now I want you to stop. Breathe. Look around your life. Ask yourself, what do you follow that punishes doubt? What doctrines do you obey without question? What parts of you did you silence just to feel accepted? That's not faith. That's design. That's engineered obedience. And if you think this story ends with forgotten cults and old journals, you're still asleep. This isn't the past. It's the operating system you were born into. Now, if you're ready to awaken, if you want to reclaim the fragments of yourself that were buried in rituals you didn't even know were rituals, I want you to comment this phrase twice below. I dissolve the mask and reclaim the root. Dartil, I dissolve the mask and reclaim the root. Say it twice, so your subconscious hears you. Say it twice, so the algorithm knows you're not just watching, you're remembering. Because every time you break a pattern, you break the spell. And every time one of us remembers, the spiral fractures. You commented the phrase, you've cracked the surface. But now, we go deeper. Let me show you what the Ravenscrofts feared most. Not exposure, not rebellion, not death. What they feared was defection. A single awakened follower could dismantle a generation of control, not by fighting back, but by remembering who they were before the rituals began. One such man was Elias Hartwell, an original vessel who vanished in 1833. Church records claimed he was elevated, but that was a lie. He escaped. And what he left behind is perhaps the most important piece of this entire puzzle. In 1877, a sealed manuscript was unearthed in a condemned root cellar beneath a farmhouse 90 miles from the Ravenwood site. It was wrapped in oilskin, bound in iron wire, and buried beneath floorboards, scorched by unnatural fire. The title, The Reverse Spiral, A Guide for the Broken. Hartwell's manifesto was no storybook. It was a manual for psychological resurrection. He described the Ravenscrofts system as a mirror of inversion. A structure designed not only to break the will, but to replace it with a surrogate identity bound by ritual and silence. But he claimed something radical. What was installed by repetition can be dismantled by revelation. He gave precise instructions: how to deprogram a believer, how to reverse language codes that had embedded guilt into pleasure, obedience into righteousness, and suffering into virtue. One technique involves speaking your original name backward while staring into a broken mirror lit only by candlelight. Not superstition, pattern disruption. Another involved writing every memory that caused shame, then burning it while listening to recorded silence. Why? Because true silence is louder than noise when your mind has been filled with commands. But here's the part that still sends chills down the spine of every scholar who's tempted. The root does not punish those who leave, it only forgets them, and that is its weakness. Hartwell believed the root, the entity, the consciousness behind it all, feeds on attention, on ritual, on cycles repeated without question. Break the cycle, and the spiral collapses. One follower at a time. You're not helpless, you were just never told where your power was buried. Now you know, now you choose. By now the veil is thin. You can feel it, can't you? That tension behind your eyes. The sense that something's watching, but only because you started looking first. That's how it always begins. Not with a knock at the door, but with a fracture in your reality, a thought you weren't supposed to have, a memory that doesn't quite match the story you were told, a dream that feels too real to be fiction. These are not glitches, they are flares, signals from the part of you the spiral couldn't crush. The Ravencraftoffs called it the undrowned soul, the piece that never bent, never surrendered. They tried everything to erase it. Pain, isolation, doctrine. But some souls refused domestication. The Church of the Pure Spirit didn't just fail because of exposure, it failed because men like Elias Hartwell carried truth in their blood, and every man who awakens carries the seed of collapse in his silence. You might think. But I'm not in a cult. Really? Let's look closer. Do you spend more hours consuming than creating? Do you need permission to change your mind? Does the idea of being alone terrify you? That's not freedom, that's programming. You were never taught how to construct your own meaning, only how to inherit systems. Systems dressed up as patriotism, education, religion, productivity, and every system built without your consent is a church, a modern cathedral of compliance, just like Ravenwood. No stone, no steeple, just expectation, guilt, punishment. And yet, that undrowned soul, it's still there. It's always been there. It's the part of you that remembers pain, not as suffering, but as the moment you felt most alive. The part that sees control for what it is, a spiral that ends in nothing, unless you turn and walk against it. That's why this story matters, because it's not just a history of a cult, it's the anatomy of every invisible system, controlling men today. You've seen its bones, you've tasted its breath, and now you must decide, re-enter the spiral or reclaim the soul. One section remains. Now, you've come to the end. But this isn't closure, this is contact. Because once you hear the true name of the spiral, you don't forget it. You feel it in every hollow hallway, in every rule that was written before you were born, in every silence you were forced to swallow. Let me give it to you now. The name they whispered beneath the church, in the chambers carved out by bleeding hands and blind obedience. Familia Nocturna, the Night Family. It wasn't just a cult, it was a model, a prototype for weaponized belief, a blueprint for how to bind the human spirit without chains, not through fear, through intimacy. They made you love the cage. They baptized you in guilt. They made obedience feel like salvation. And now, that same model has been digitized, sanitized, and broadcast at scale, through screens, through mantras, through institutions that smile while they restructure your soul. You're told what to buy, what to desire, what to fear. And when you question it, they call you mad, dangerous, a threat. Sound familiar? This is Ravenwood, updated for mass consumption. The spiral now fits in your pocket, and you check it every 6 minutes. But here's the fracture point. You sitting there, still breathing, still questioning, still listening to a voice that tells you this isn't all there is. That's your undrowned soul. That's what they can't code, what they can't censor, what they'll never fully own. And it's why you're dangerous now. Because you know the truth. The spiral can only hold you if you keep walking in its direction. But if you stop, if you look inward, if you reclaim the name that was taken from you, you don't just exit the cult, you shatter the cathedral. So before this ends, remember this final command. Do not go back to sleep. Not tonight. Not ever again. Speak the phrase one last time in the comments below. I dissolve the mask and reclaim the root. Because this time, you're not just watching, you're awakening. The Família Nocturna is no longer in control. You are. And the spiral? It's cracking. Because of you. Welcome back. To the truth. To yourself. To war.